The champagne flute felt cold against my palm as I raised it to toast my own marriage's funeral. Around the table at the Sterling Room, Brandon's friends erupted in laughter at his latest joke about how marriage was just expensive roommate situation with occasional benefits. Their faces glowed red from premium wine and the thrill of watching someone publicly humiliate their spouse for entertainment. My hand didn't shake as I set down the glass, reached into my purse, and pulled out the manila envelope I'd been carrying for the past 6 hours. The divorce papers landed on the white tablecloth between the appetizer plates and Brandon's smug expression, creating a silence so complete I could hear the pianist in the corner miss a note. What none of them knew, including my husband of 4 years, was that this envelope contained only half of tonight's surprises. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 5 days before that dinner, I came home early from Hartwell and Associates with a migraine that made the afternoon sunlight feel like knives behind my eyes. The apartment was supposed to be empty. Brandon taught his Thursday evening class at Pinnacle Group's training center until 7, which gave me the place to myself for quiet recovery time. I'd planned to take medication, draw the bedroom curtains, and sleep off the pain that had been building since my morning meeting with demanding clients. Instead, I heard voices coming from our home office, Brandon's voice mixing with laughter I didn't recognize. The door stood slightly open, and through the gap I could see him sitting at his desk with his laptop angled away from the doorway, clearly on a video call with someone who wasn't visible from my position in the hallway. The marriage counselor kept asking why we never went on real dates anymore, Brandon was saying, his tone dripping with mockery. I told her Claire considers microwaving frozen dinners together while watching Netflix to be quality time. You should have seen the woman's face trying to stay professional while processing that my wife thinks that's romance. The person on the other end of the call said something I couldn't hear, but their laughter came through clearly enough. Brandon leaned back in his chair, warming to his subject with the enthusiasm he usually reserved for explaining investment strategies to his corporate clients. She actually suggested we recreate our first date, he continued. Like going back to that mediocre Italian place where we ate 4 years ago is going to fix the fact that I married someone whose idea of ambition is making it through another week without causing problems at her boring accounting job. My migraine disappeared instantly, replaced by a clarity so sharp it felt like my vision had suddenly adjusted after years of looking through foggy glass. I stood frozen in our hallway, still holding my purse and jacket, listening to my husband describe our marriage as a practical arrangement he'd settled for when better options hadn't materialized. The counselor recommended I tell Claire she's appreciated, Brandon continued. But honestly, appreciation for what? She does her job adequately, keeps the apartment relatively clean, and doesn't cause drama. That's just basic adult functioning, not something that deserves constant praise and validation. His words landed like physical blows, each one precise and devastating. I backed away from the office door silently, my body moving on autopilot while my mind processed this new understanding of my reality. The man I'd loved since we met at a professional networking mixer, the person I'd supported through his career transitions and celebrated with during his successes, saw me as adequate at best and burdensome at worst. Our marriage wasn't struggling because of communication issues or different love languages or any of the other therapeutic explanations our counselor had offered. It was dying because Brandon fundamentally didn't respect me as a human being worth his genuine affection or consideration. I left the apartment as quietly as I'd entered it, taking the stairs instead of the elevator to avoid any noise that might alert Brandon to my presence. My car sat in the underground parking garage where I'd left it 20 minutes earlier, back when I'd still believed my husband's complaints about our relationship stemmed from stress or miscommunication rather than contempt. The steering wheel felt solid and real under my hands as I sat in the driver's seat, staring at the concrete wall in front of my parking space. Tears would have been appropriate, but none came. Instead, I felt a strange calm settling over me like a blanket, protective and clarifying. The realization hit me that I'd been performing in a one-person play for months, maybe longer. Every effort to improve our connection, every suggestion for activities we might enjoy together, every attempt to understand Brandon's growing distance had been met with the kind of polite tolerance someone might show a child's crude drawing. He'd been humoring me while mocking my efforts to people I'd never met, turning our private struggles into entertainment for an audience who apparently found my inadequacy amusing. The marriage counseling sessions we'd started 3 months ago weren't healing anything because only one person in the relationship believed there was something worth saving. I drove to Riverside Commons and parked near the fountain where young families fed ducks and couples walked hand in hand during the early evening hours. The normalcy of the scene felt jarring against my internal chaos. Parents pushed strollers past benches where teenagers shared earbuds and swayed to music only they could hear. An elderly couple sat on a bench nearby, her head resting on his shoulder as they watched the water cascade down the fountain's tiers. These people existed in a world where partnerships meant mutual respect and affection, where spouses defended each other rather than using marriage as material for comedy routines with strangers. My phone buzzed with a text from Brandon asking where I was and mentioning he'd noticed my car was gone from the garage. The casual tone of his message felt obscene after what I'd overheard. "Traffic was terrible, so I'm running late," I typed back, the lie coming easily now that I understood our entire relationship had been built on his deception about his true feelings. "Grab something to eat without me." His response came quickly with a thumbs-up emoji and a comment about ordering Thai food from the place near our apartment. The mundane exchange highlighted how completely normal everything would have seemed if I hadn't come home early and discovered the truth hiding behind our everyday interactions. Diane Martinez answered my call on the second ring, her voice bright with the kind of uncomplicated happiness I remembered feeling before marriage had become a performance evaluation I was constantly failing. Her greeting shifted to concern within seconds as she picked up on something wrong in my silence. "I need to see you," I told her, hearing my voice sound distant and strange. "Can you meet me somewhere tonight?" Diane had been my closest friend since college, back when we'd shared an apartment and dreams about careers that would let us travel and make a difference in the world. She'd warned me about moving too fast with Brandon, gently suggesting that his charm might be masking qualities that would emerge later. I dismissed her concerns as overprotectiveness, certain that she'd understand him better once she got to know him. Now her caution felt like prophecy I should have heeded. We met at a quiet coffee shop in a neighborhood neither of us frequented, a neutral territory where we wouldn't risk running into anyone from my work or Brandon's social circle. Diane listened without interrupting as I recounted what I'd overheard, her expression shifting from shock to anger to something that looked like relief. "I'm not surprised," she finally said when I'd finished describing Brandon's call. "I'm furious that he's been treating you this way, but I'm not surprised." She'd noticed his subtle put-downs during group gatherings, the way he'd correct my stories or dismiss my observations in front of others. His humor often came at my expense, packaged as playful teasing that left me feeling small while everyone else laughed at how silly I was being about innocent jokes. The coffee shop around us filled with the evening crowd as we talked, people meeting after work to decompress or students settling in with laptops and textbooks. Normal people living normal lives where their partners didn't mock them to strangers during video calls. Diane reached across the small table and gripped my hand with fierce intensity. "You deserve so much better than someone who treats you like you're lucky he settled for you," she said. "What are you going to do?" The question hung in the air between us, heavy with implications about how my life was about to change. I could confront Brandon about what I'd heard, demand explanations and apologies, possibly salvage something from our damaged marriage through intensive counseling and his commitment to change. Or I could accept that his contempt for me was fundamental rather than circumstantial, a core aspect of how he viewed our relationship rather than a temporary phase brought on by external stress. "I don't know yet," I admitted, "but I know I can't keep pretending everything's fine while he treats our marriage like a burden he's nobly bearing." Diane nodded, her support absolute and uncomplicated in a way that made Brandon's conditional affection even more painful by comparison. "Whatever you decide, I'm here," she promised. "If you need a place to stay or just someone to talk to at 3 in the morning, call me." Her offer felt like a lifeline thrown to someone drowning in deep water, something solid to grab onto while I figured out how to swim to shore. I returned to the apartment near midnight, timing my arrival to coincide with when Brandon would likely be asleep. The lights were off except for the lamp he always left on in the living room when I came home late. A note on the kitchen counter explained that he'd saved me some pad thai in the refrigerator, his handwriting cheerful and unaware that I'd uncovered the truth about his actual feelings. The normalcy of the gesture felt grotesque, this performance of caring he maintained while privately explaining to others how little he valued me or our life together. Sleep didn't come that night despite my exhaustion. I lay in our bed listening to Brandon's steady breathing, this stranger I'd shared a home with for 4 years without truly understanding how he perceived me. Morning light eventually filtered through the curtains, marking the beginning of what would become the strangest week of my life. Brandon woke cheerful and affectionate, kissing my forehead before heading to the shower and asking if I wanted to grab breakfast together before work. His performance was flawless, giving no indication that he'd spent yesterday evening mocking our marriage to an unknown audience who apparently found my shortcomings entertaining. I made excuses about an early meeting and left the apartment before him, unable to sit across a table pretending everything was normal when I now heard every word he spoke through the filter of his true contempt. Work provided a welcome distraction, though Trish and Gwyn noticed immediately that something was wrong. We'd become close over the past 2 years at Hartwell and Associates, bonding over difficult clients and our shared determination to prove ourselves in a firm where most senior positions went to men who looked and acted like they'd stepped out of a corporate training video from the 1980s. "You look like you haven't slept," Trish observed during our morning coffee run to the cafe across from our office building. "Everything okay at home?" Her question was gentle but direct, inviting confidence without demanding it. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I found myself telling her everything, the words spilling out in the coffee line as other professionals ordered complicated drinks and checked their phones. Trish's expression darkened as I described Brandon's video call and his casual dismissal of our relationship as something he'd settled for when better options hadn't appeared. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, processing what I'd shared while we collected our orders and found a table away from other customers. "That's emotional abuse," Trish said finally, her voice low but firm. "Maybe he's not yelling or throwing things, but he's systematically undermining your sense of worth while presenting a false version of himself to you." She'd been through her own difficult divorce 3 years earlier, escaping a marriage where her ex-husband's controlling behavior had escalated so gradually she hadn't recognized it as abuse until her sister intervened. Now she volunteered at a support center for people leaving toxic relationships, helping others navigate the practical and emotional challenges of extraction from partnerships that had become prisons. I hadn't thought of Brandon's behavior as abuse because it lacked the obvious markers I associated with the term. He didn't control my movements or isolate me from friends or explode in violent rages that required police intervention. But Trish's words resonated with something I'd been feeling without having language to describe it. The constant subtle criticism disguised as concern or humor, the dismissal of my feelings as overreactions, the way he positioned himself as the reasonable one tolerating my supposed emotional instability, all of it formed a pattern designed to keep me doubting myself while he maintained the moral high ground. The rest of that day at work passed in a blur of spreadsheets and client calls that required me to sound competent and professional while my internal world was reorganizing itself around this new understanding. Leonard Foster, our department head, stopped by my desk late in the afternoon with feedback on a project I'd completed ahead of schedule. "Your analysis on the Berkshire account was exceptionally thorough," he said, his praise straightforward and genuine. "The client specifically mentioned how much they appreciated your attention to detail and creative solutions." His words should have felt good, but instead they highlighted the contrast between professional recognition and personal dismissal. At work, people valued my contributions and treated me with respect I'd stopped receiving at home. That evening, I researched divorce attorneys on my phone while Brandon watched television in the next room, completely unaware that his wife was planning her exit strategy. The websites all asked similar questions about grounds for divorce and division of assets, practical considerations that felt overwhelming when I was still processing the emotional devastation of discovering my husband's contempt. We'd been married in Belmont 4 years ago in a small ceremony at Harborview Bistro, surrounded by close friends and family who'd celebrated what seemed like the beginning of a beautiful partnership. Now I was calculating how to legally dissolve what had apparently been a mistake Brandon regretted but lacked the courage to admit directly. Consultation appointments with 3 different attorneys filled my lunch breaks over the next 2 days. Each lawyer asked me to explain why I was seeking divorce, and each time I recounted Brandon's video call the story sounded worse out loud than it had in my head. The third attorney, a woman named Victoria Chen who specialized in cases involving emotional abuse and financial manipulation, listened with the kind of focused attention that made me feel heard rather than judged. "Your husband has been devaluing you systematically," she explained after I'd finished describing our marriage. "The therapy sessions where he positioned himself as the patient spouse dealing with your supposed issues, the jokes at your expense in social settings, the overheard conversation where he mocked you to strangers. This is a pattern of behavior designed to keep you feeling grateful he stays rather than recognizing you deserve better. Victoria outlined the process for filing in our state, explaining that I could cite irreconcilable differences without having to prove fault or detail Brandon's emotional cruelty in court documents. The goal would be a clean separation of assets and a quick resolution that let me move forward without prolonged legal battles. "Do you have somewhere safe to stay once you file?" she asked. Many people underestimate how their spouse will react when they realize they're losing control of the narrative. Her question made me realize I'd been planning the legal logistics without considering the practical realities of actually leaving. Diane offered her spare bedroom immediately when I called that evening from my parked car outside the apartment building. "Stay as long as you need," she insisted. "Seriously, Claire, I've been hoping you'd realize you deserve better than how he treats you." Her enthusiasm for my escape was touching and slightly heartbreaking, highlighting how obvious my situation had apparently been to people who cared about me while I'd been too close to see it clearly. That night, I began quietly moving important documents and sentimental items to my car, smuggling out pieces of my life in small batches that wouldn't alert Brandon to my planning. The marriage counselor appointment on Wednesday felt surreal now that I knew I was ending the relationship rather than trying to save it. Brandon performed beautifully for Dr. Helen Warren, expressing concern about my recent distance and his desire to reconnect despite the challenges we'd been facing. He spoke about love languages and quality time with the fluency of someone who'd memorized therapeutic concepts without internalizing their meaning. I sat beside him on the overstuffed couch in her office, watching this performance while remembering his video call where he'd mocked these same sessions as pointless exercises in managing my emotional needs. Dr. Warren asked me to share my perspective, and for the first time in months of counseling I told the complete truth. I described the video call I'd overheard, Brandon's mockery of our marriage and his dismissal of me as someone he'd settled for when better options hadn't materialized. The room went silent except for the white noise machine by the door that was supposed to ensure privacy. Brandon's face cycled through denial and damage control, his mouth opening and closing as he searched for explanations that might minimize what I'd heard. "That's not what I meant," he started, but I held up my hand to stop him. "I don't need explanations or apologies," I told him, my voice calmer than I'd expected it to be. "I need you to understand that I'm done pretending your contempt for me is something I can fix by being more interesting or less needy or whatever standard you've decided I'm failing to meet." Dr. Warren looked between us with professional concern, probably recognizing that this marriage had moved beyond her ability to mediate. Brandon attempted to salvage the situation with reassurances about how stress had made him say things he didn't mean, but his words felt hollow now that I'd heard his true feelings expressed with such casual certainty. The counseling session ended early at my request, and we drove home in silence heavy with everything unsaid. Brandon tried several times to start conversations that would let him explain or apologize, but I had no interest in hearing more performances. The decision was made, the attorney hired, the papers drawn up and ready for my signature. All that remained was choosing the moment to end this charade in a way that made clear I was leaving from a position of strength rather than defeat. Saturday evening arrived with Brandon's announcement that he'd made reservations at the Sterling Room for dinner with Garrett Sullivan and some other friends from Pinnacle Group. The Sterling Room was Belmont's newest upscale restaurant, the kind of place where reservations required weeks of advance notice and entrees cost more than I typically spent on groceries for a week. Brandon presented the dinner as a treat for me, a chance to dress up and socialize with people who were important to his career. His generosity felt calculated now that I understood his actual motivations, this public display of having an acceptable wife who could be trotted out for social occasions when necessary. I agreed to attend with a calmness that seemed to relieve him, probably grateful I wasn't going to cause problems or embarrass him in front of his professional contacts. What Brandon didn't know was that I'd picked up the finalized divorce papers from Victoria Chen's office that afternoon. The manila envelope sat in my purse as I dressed for dinner, choosing a navy dress that was elegant without being flashy. My reflection in the bathroom mirror showed someone who looked composed and appropriate for an evening at an expensive restaurant. Only I knew that tonight would mark the end of my marriage in the most public way possible. The drive to the Sterling Room took 20 minutes through downtown Belmont, past the business district where both our offices were located and into the revitalized warehouse area that now housed trendy restaurants and art galleries. Brandon chatted about work politics and his recent success closing a major client, completely at ease in a way that would have seemed normal a week ago. Now I heard every word through the lens of his private contempt, recognizing how his stories always positioned him as the capable one navigating challenges while others around him fumbled or needed his guidance. The Sterling Room occupied a converted industrial space with exposed brick walls and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the river. Pendant lights hung at varying heights over tables draped in white linen, and the open kitchen let diners watch chefs prepare elaborate dishes with theatrical precision. Brandon's friends had already arrived and claimed a large round table near the windows, their laughter audible from the entrance as we checked in with the hostess. Garrett Sullivan raised his wine glass in greeting as we approached, his smile wide and welcoming in a way that would have felt friendly before I understood these people were part of the audience for Brandon's ongoing commentary about our failing marriage. The introductions rolled past with names and faces I'd met before at various company events and social gatherings. Vanessa Pierce sat to Garrett's right, her sharp suit and confident posture marking her as someone who took professional image seriously. Monica Davis, Brandon's sister, occupied the seat that would put her directly across from me during dinner, her expression mixing polite greeting with the subtle disapproval I'd grown accustomed to receiving from Brandon's family. Two other couples rounded out the table, work friends whose names I remembered but whose personalities hadn't made enough impression to stick beyond surface pleasantries. The conversation flowed easily as we settled into our seats and reviewed menus that listed entrees without prices, the kind of calculated omission meant to signal that cost shouldn't factor into ordering decisions. Brandon ordered wine for the table with the casual authority of someone accustomed to making group decisions without consulting others. Around me, his friends discussed upcoming promotions and office politics, their inside jokes and shared references highlighting how peripheral I was to Brandon's actual social life. This dinner wasn't about spending time with me as his wife but about performing the role of successful married man to an audience that valued conventional markers of stability. The appetizers arrived as Garrett launched into a story about a disastrous client meeting that had somehow resulted in landing a major account. His telling relied heavily on mocking the client's lack of sophistication and his own clever maneuvering to salvage the situation. The table laughed at appropriate moments, and I found myself analyzing the group dynamic with anthropological detachment. These people bonded through shared superiority over others, finding connection in their collective judgment of anyone who didn't meet their standards for acceptable behavior or professional competence. Brandon contributed his own story about dealing with what he termed a problem employee who needed extensive hand-holding to complete basic tasks. His impatience with people he perceived as less capable came through clearly in his tone and word choices. The others nodded sympathetically, sharing their own experiences managing incompetent subordinates or navigating bureaucracies staffed by people who didn't understand efficiency. Their conversation revealed a worldview where most people were obstacles to be managed rather than individuals deserving respect and consideration. The wine flowed freely as we moved through courses, loosening tongues and lowering whatever filters usually govern social appropriateness. Vanessa made a comment about how lucky Brandon was to have such an understanding wife given his demanding work schedule, her tone suggesting this was actually criticism disguised as compliment. Monica chimed in with agreement, noting that many women wouldn't be so accepting of husbands who prioritized career advancement over domestic partnership. Their words positioned my supposed understanding as weakness rather than virtue, another form of inadequacy I was demonstrating by not demanding more from Brandon. Brandon laughed and raised his wine glass in what appeared to be a toast to me. "Claire's definitely low maintenance," he said, his smile not reaching his eyes. "She's perfectly happy with Netflix and takeout while I handle the actual adult responsibilities." The table laughed with him, finding humor in this characterization of our marriage as arrangement where he carried the weight while I coasted along contributing minimal effort. My hand tightened around my own wine glass as I felt the familiar sensation of being made small for their entertainment, my role in this social gathering apparently being the amiable wife who accepted mockery as affection. Garrett picked up the thread, joking about how marriage was essentially expensive roommate situations with occasional benefits. The crude reduction of partnership to financial transaction and physical convenience drew knowing laughs from the men at the table while the women smiled with expressions that suggested they'd heard similar sentiments before. Brandon nodded along enthusiastically, adding that the key to successful marriage was managing expectations downward until you reached a sustainable level of disappointment. His words were meant to sound worldly and humorous, but they carried undertones of genuine belief that made his friends uncomfortable enough to shift the conversation slightly. Monica tried to soften her brother's comments by suggesting that all marriages required compromise and adjustment to different values. But her effort at diplomacy came too late and felt too weak to counterbalance the damage Brandon had done by reducing our partnership to a business arrangement he was managing competently despite my limitations. The table fell into brief awkward silence before Garrett launched into a new topic about upcoming vacation plans, steering us away from the minefield Brandon had created. I excused myself to the restroom, needing a moment away from the table and their casual cruelty. The Sterling Room's bathroom was as carefully designed as its dining room, all marble and soft lighting meant to make patrons feel pampered and elegant. I stood at the sink, looking at my reflection and seeing someone who'd been slowly disappearing under the weight of constant judgment. The woman in the mirror looked tired and sad despite her careful makeup and appropriate dinner attire. She looked like someone who'd forgotten she deserved better than what she was accepting. The manila envelope in my purse felt heavy and purposeful, filled with legal documents that would end my marriage before dessert arrived at our table. Victoria Chen had explained that serving divorce papers in public wasn't legally required but could be psychologically powerful, a statement that I was reclaiming control over my narrative rather than accepting Brandon's version of our relationship. The timing would be dramatic and potentially uncomfortable for everyone present, but discomfort felt appropriate given how comfortable Brandon had been mocking me to these same people for however long this had been going on. I returned to the table as the main courses arrived, elaborately plated dishes that looked more like art installations than food meant for consumption. Brandon had ordered for both of us without asking my preference, choosing the restaurant's signature ribeye while assuming I'd be happy with whatever he selected. His presumption would have passed unnoticed a week ago, just another small moment where his preferences superseded mine without discussion or consideration. Now it felt like one more piece of evidence that he'd never seen me as an equal partner whose input deserved equal weight. The conversation had shifted to complaints about a mutual friend's wife who apparently didn't understand the demands of corporate life and made unreasonable requests for her husband's time and attention. The group discussed this absent woman with the kind of casual contempt that revealed how they viewed wives generally, as accessories whose needs were secondary to career advancement and professional networking. Brandon participated enthusiastically in this character assassination of someone not present to defend herself, demonstrating the same lack of loyalty he'd shown when mocking our marriage to strangers during his video call. My entree sat untouched in front of me as I made my decision. The moment felt right in a way I couldn't fully articulate but recognized instinctively. These people needed to understand that their casual cruelty had consequences, that treating partners as burdens to be managed rather than people to be cherished would eventually result in those partners choosing themselves over maintaining comfortable fictions. Brandon was mid-sentence about marriage being essentially a practical arrangement that shouldn't be romanticized beyond its functional benefits when I stood up from the table, drawing everyone's attention by the unexpectedness of the movement. I reached into my purse and pulled out the manila envelope, feeling the weight of it in my hands and the rightness of what I was about to do. The table went quiet as I placed the envelope deliberately on the white tablecloth between Brandon's ribeye and the wine bottle he'd been refilling his glass from throughout dinner. His confusion was obvious as he looked from the envelope to my face, trying to understand what was happening and why I was disrupting the meal with whatever this dramatic gesture meant. "These are divorce papers," I said clearly, my voice carrying across our table and probably to nearby diners who'd noticed the sudden shift in atmosphere. "I'm filing for dissolution of our marriage effective immediately." The words felt powerful leaving my mouth, each one marking a step away from the woman who'd accepted contempt as affection and mockery as humor. The silence that followed my announcement stretched across the Sterling Room like spilled wine spreading across white linen. Brandon's face cycled through confusion, disbelief, and something that looked almost like fear as he stared at the manila envelope between us. His friends had frozen mid-motion, wine glasses suspended halfway to mouths, forks hovering over expensive entrees that suddenly seemed irrelevant to everyone at the table. The pianist in the corner continued playing soft jazz, oblivious to the drama unfolding near the windows, creating a surreal soundtrack to the dismantling of my marriage. Brandon's hand reached toward the envelope but stopped short of actually touching it, as if the papers inside might burn him. "This is a joke, right?" His voice came out strained and uncertain, lacking the confidence that usually characterized how he spoke in public settings. "You're making some kind of point about the conversation, and now we can all laugh and move past this awkward moment." His attempt to reframe my action as performance rather than genuine declaration showed how completely he'd misunderstood both my character and my resolve. I'm entirely serious, I replied, keeping my voice level and clear despite the adrenaline coursing through my body. I've retained Victoria Chen as my attorney, and these papers outline the terms for ending our marriage. You can review them at your convenience, but my decision is final and non-negotiable. The formality of my language felt appropriate for the moment, marking this as legal action rather than emotional outburst. Around us, other diners had begun noticing the tension at our table, their conversations dropping to whispers as they tried to discern what was happening. Garrett Sullivan cleared his throat uncomfortably, his earlier joviality completely evaporated in the face of actual marital dissolution happening in front of him. Maybe you two should discuss this privately, he suggested weakly, gesturing vaguely toward the restaurant's exit as if removing the scene from public view would somehow make it less real. His discomfort was palpable. This man who'd spent the evening joking about marriage being an expensive burden now confronted with the reality of one actually ending. There's nothing to discuss, I said, addressing Garrett directly since Brandon seemed incapable of formulating responses. Brandon made his feelings about our marriage very clear during a video call last Thursday, when he explained to someone I've never met that he'd settled for me when better options hadn't materialized. He described me as adequate at basic adult functioning but not worthy of appreciation or genuine affection. I paused, letting those words land with their full weight. So I'm simply accepting his assessment and freeing him from the burden of continuing a marriage he clearly views as a mistake. Monica Davis's face had gone pale, her earlier smugness replaced by obvious horror as she processed what I was revealing about her brother. The other couples at the table exchanged glances that mixed shock with what looked almost like vindication, as if they'd suspected something was wrong with Brandon's marriage but hadn't expected confirmation to arrive quite so dramatically. Vanessa Pierce set down her wine glass carefully, her sharp professional demeanor cracking slightly as she realized she was witnessing something that would become office gossip by Monday morning. Brandon finally found his voice, though it came out defensive and sharp. "You're taking that completely out of context," he said, his face flushing red with anger or embarrassment or both. That was a private conversation where I was venting frustration, not a comprehensive statement of my feelings about our entire relationship. His attempt to minimize what I'd overheard revealed how little he understood about the damage those words had caused, as if the privacy of his mockery somehow made it less devastating than if he'd said it to my face. The context was perfectly clear, I countered, maintaining my composure despite wanting to shout at him about the months of subtle cruelty and systematic devaluation I'd endured. You told someone that our marriage counselor asking you to show me appreciation was pointless because I only perform basic adult functions adequately. You mocked my career, my interests, and my expectation that marriage should involve actual affection rather than just cohabitation with occasional benefits. Your words, Brandon, not mine. The table had descended into complete silence except for the ambient noise of the restaurant around us. Nearby diners weren't even pretending not to watch anymore, their attention fully captured by this public dissolution of a marriage happening over entrees that were growing cold. The waitstaff hovered at a distance, uncertain whether to approach our table or give us space to resolve whatever crisis was unfolding. The manager stood near the kitchen entrance, his body language suggesting he was calculating whether he needed to intervene to protect other guests' dining experiences. Garrett made another attempt to salvage the situation, his loyalty to Brandon overriding his obvious discomfort. Everyone says things they don't mean when they're stressed, he offered, as if stress justified casual cruelty toward a spouse. Brandon's been under tremendous pressure at work, and sometimes that comes out in ways that sound worse than intended. His defense felt automatic and unconvincing, the kind of excuse people made for friends because acknowledging their bad behavior would require uncomfortable confrontations about character and values. I'm not interested in excuses or explanations, I said, feeling surprisingly calm given the magnitude of what I was doing. I spent months trying to be more interesting, more ambitious, more whatever Brandon decided I was lacking. I attended therapy sessions where he positioned himself as the patient spouse dealing with my emotional needs while privately mocking those same sessions to strangers. I'm done performing for an audience that will never appreciate the show. Monica found her voice finally, her tone carrying the same disapproving edge I'd grown accustomed to hearing from Brandon's family. This is incredibly inappropriate, Claire. Whatever issues you're having should be handled privately, not turned into public spectacle at an expensive restaurant in front of Brandon's colleagues. Her concern was clearly more about protecting her brother's reputation than addressing the substance of my complaints, prioritizing appearance over accountability in ways that felt entirely predictable. What's inappropriate is your brother spending 4 years treating me like an obligation he was nobly fulfilling rather than a partner he'd chosen to build a life with, I replied, looking directly at Monica. What's inappropriate is him mocking our marriage to entertain people while presenting a false version of himself to me. This public moment isn't me creating drama, it's me refusing to continue protecting him from the consequences of his own actions. Brandon's face had shifted from red to an ashen color that suggested genuine panic was setting in as he processed that this wasn't a dramatic gesture I could be talked down from. "Claire, please," he said, his voice dropping to something approaching sincerity for the first time all evening. "Can we go somewhere and talk about this rationally? This doesn't have to happen this way." His plea revealed that he'd expected to control the narrative and timing of any potential separation, that having his wife publicly declare the marriage over was somehow more devastating than if he'd been the one to initiate the end. "There's nothing left to discuss," I told him, picking up my purse and preparing to leave before this scene stretched any longer. "My attorney will contact you about scheduling to divide assets and finalize paperwork. I'm staying with a friend, so you'll have the apartment to yourself until we figure out more permanent arrangements." The practical details felt important to establish, marking this as genuine legal action rather than emotional threat designed to extract apologies or promises of change. "Where are you going?" Brandon asked, standing up from the table as if he might physically prevent me from leaving. "You can't just drop divorce papers and walk out without explaining what you want me to do to fix this." His question revealed the fundamental disconnect between us, his assumption that my filing for divorce was negotiating tactic rather than final decision. He still believed that the right combination of words or promises could repair damage that went far deeper than any single conversation could address. "I'm going to start my life over without someone who views me as adequate at best and burdensome at worst," I said simply. "What you do is entirely up to you, but it won't involve me anymore." I turned away from the table, feeling the weight of multiple gazes following me as I walked through the Sterling room toward the exit. The manager moved slightly as if to intercept me, probably concerned about unpaid bills or restaurant policies, but something in my expression must have convinced him to let me pass without confrontation. The cool evening air hit my face as I pushed through the restaurant's heavy entrance doors, the temperature contrast making me realize how overheated I'd become during that final confrontation. My hands shook slightly as I searched my purse for car keys, the adrenaline that had sustained me through the scene finally catching up with my nervous system. Behind me, I could hear raised voices from inside the Sterling room, probably Brandon and his friends processing what had just happened and deciding how to minimize damage to his reputation among their social circle. My car sat in the parking structure 2 blocks away, and I walked quickly through downtown Belmont's evening crowds without really seeing the people around me. Couples strolled hand in hand past boutiques and galleries, completely unaware that someone moving through their midst had just publicly ended her marriage at an upscale restaurant. The normalcy of the scene felt jarring against my internal chaos, highlighting how completely my world had shifted while everyone else's Friday evening continued uninterrupted. Diane answered her phone on the first ring, her voice immediately concerned when she heard my shaky greeting. "I did it," I told her, unlocking my car and sitting in the driver's seat without starting the engine. "I served him divorce papers at dinner in front of all his friends." The words sounded surreal spoken out loud, confirming that I'd actually followed through with the plan we discussed in theory without knowing if I'd have the courage to execute it publicly. "Oh my God, Claire," Diane breathed, her shock mixed with what sounded like pride. "Are you okay? Where are you right now?" Her practical questions helped ground me in the immediate moment rather than spiraling into anxiety about what I'd just done. I gave her my location and she instructed me to drive directly to her apartment, promising to have wine and takeout waiting regardless of whether I felt like eating or just wanted to process everything that had happened. The drive to Diane's place in the Westridge neighborhood took 30 minutes through light traffic, giving me time to replay the dinner scene in my head and analyze whether I'd handled it appropriately. Part of me wished I'd been calmer or more eloquent in my declarations, but another part recognized that perfection wasn't the goal. The point had been to stop accepting treatment that diminished me, to publicly declare that I valued myself enough to walk away from someone who didn't. By that measure, the evening had been a complete success regardless of how awkward or dramatic the execution had been. Diane greeted me at her apartment door with a fierce hug that lasted longer than usual, her solidarity and support flowing through the physical contact. "I've got Thai food coming," she announced, pulling me inside and guiding me to her comfortable couch. "And I stopped at the store for that wine you like, the one Brandon always said was too sweet but you enjoyed anyway." Her attention to that small detail made me realize how many preferences I'd stopped acknowledging during my marriage, how many aspects of my personality I'd minimized to avoid Brandon's subtle criticism. The apartment felt warm and welcoming in ways my own home hadn't for months. Diane's eclectic decorating style reflected her actual interests rather than carefully curated image concerns. Books overflowed from shelves, plants in various states of thriving or dying covered available surfaces, and framed photos showed genuine moments of joy rather than posed family portraits. This was what home should feel like, I thought, a place where someone could be fully themselves without constant awareness of being evaluated against impossible standards. "Tell me everything," Diane demanded once we'd settled on her couch with wine glasses that were probably too full by responsible drinking standards but felt exactly right for the circumstances. "What did he say? How did his horrible friends react? Did anyone try to defend you?" Her questions tumbled out eager for details, and I found myself recounting the entire evening from arriving at the Sterling room to walking out past the shocked manager. The satisfaction in Diane's expression grew as I described placing the divorce papers on the table and delivering my prepared statements about Brandon's video call and his treatment of our marriage. When I reached the part about Monica trying to scold me for inappropriate public behavior, Diane actually cheered out loud. "His sister has always acted like you weren't good enough for their precious family," she said with obvious disdain. "I'm glad you finally told them all exactly what kind of person Brandon really is behind his professional charm." My phone had been buzzing continuously in my purse throughout the drive and my first hour at Diane's apartment. I finally pulled it out to find 17 missed calls from Brandon, 12 text messages that ranged from angry to pleading, and several voicemails I had no interest in listening to. There were also messages from Monica, Garrett, and even Vanessa Pierce, all presumably trying to either defend Brandon or convince me to reconsider my dramatic public declaration. The volume of contact attempts suggested they were panicking about how tonight's events might affect Brandon's professional reputation or their social circle's perception of him. "You don't have to respond to any of that," Diane said firmly when she saw me scrolling through the notifications. "Block them all if you need to. Your attorney can handle any necessary communication about the divorce, and everyone else's opinions about your decision are completely irrelevant." Her protective instinct reminded me why we'd remained close friends despite my marriage pulling me away from many other relationships. Diane had always prioritized my well-being over social conventions or other people's comfort levels. The Thai food arrived as my phone started buzzing again with another call from Brandon. Diane grabbed the device from my hand and switched it to silent mode before setting it face down on her coffee table. "Tonight is about you processing what happened and recognizing how brave you were," she declared. "Brandon doesn't get any more of your emotional energy." Her firm boundary setting felt liberating rather than controlling, someone protecting my space when I was too drained to defend it myself. We ate pad thai and green curry directly from takeout containers while I continued processing the evening's events. The food tasted better than it should have given my emotional state, probably because eating it meant I wasn't sitting across from Brandon at some restaurant while he critiqued my order choices or explained why his selection was objectively superior. Simple pleasures like choosing my own food without commentary felt revolutionary after years of subtle control I hadn't fully recognized until stepping outside the relationship. Diane wanted to know what happened next in terms of practical logistics. Victoria Chen had explained that serving the papers initiated a waiting period during which Brandon could respond to the terms I'd outlined or contest specific aspects of the division of assets. Given that we'd only been married 4 years and had no children, the process should be relatively straightforward barring any attempts by Brandon to complicate proceedings out of spite or control. The apartment lease was in both our names, but I had no interest in fighting to keep a space so thoroughly associated with the slow erosion of my self-worth. "I need to get my remaining things from the apartment," I told Diane, already dreading the logistics of that extraction. Clothes, personal items, some furniture that was mine before the marriage. The thought of facing Brandon during that process felt overwhelming, but leaving my belongings behind would mean starting over with nothing but what I'd already smuggled out during my planning phase. Diane immediately offered to accompany me whenever I decided to retrieve my things, bringing additional friends as backup if necessary to ensure I wouldn't have to face Brandon alone or be manipulated into conversations I didn't want to have. The evening stretched long as we talked through everything that had led to tonight's public divorce filing. Diane had witnessed much of Brandon's behavior over the years, but hearing my comprehensive account of the systematic devaluation helped her understand why I'd reached a breaking point. "You've been slowly disappearing," she observed at one point. The confident, funny woman I lived with in college turned into this careful, anxious person constantly monitoring whether she was being adequate enough. "I'm so glad you're getting yourself back." Her words made me realize how much I'd changed during my marriage without consciously recognizing the transformation. I'd stopped expressing opinions that might contradict Brandon's, stopped suggesting activities he might find boring, stopped talking about work achievements that might highlight his comparative lack of advancement. My entire personality had been slowly edited down to a version Brandon found acceptable, which was apparently barely tolerable based on his private comments to others. The woman sitting on Diane's couch eating Thai food was a shadow of who I'd been before marriage, and reclaiming that original self would require more than just legal divorce papers. Around midnight, Diane showed me to her guest bedroom, which she'd already prepared with fresh sheets and towels as if she'd known I'd end up staying the night. The room was small but comfortable, decorated in soft blues and greens that felt calming after the emotional intensity of the evening. I changed into borrowed pajamas and climbed into bed, expecting my racing thoughts to prevent sleep for hours. Instead, exhaustion claimed me almost immediately, my body finally relaxing now that I wasn't maintaining constant vigilance about Brandon's moods or judgments. I woke to sunlight streaming through unfamiliar windows and a moment of disorientation before remembering where I was and why. My phone, which I'd left on Diane's coffee table, would probably be full of new messages from Brandon and his allies trying various strategies to convince me to reconsider. The thought of facing all that communication felt exhausting, but ignoring it entirely might cause complications with the legal proceedings. Victoria Chen had advised me to document any harassment or attempts at manipulation, which meant I'd need to at least review what Brandon was saying even if I didn't respond. Diane was already awake, making coffee in her small kitchen and humming along to music playing from her phone. "Morning," she greeted me with a smile that contained both sympathy and encouragement. "How are you feeling about everything in the bright light of day?" Her question invited honest reflection rather than demanding false positivity, giving me space to admit if I was struggling with my decision without judgment about what that meant. "I feel lighter," I admitted, surprising myself with the truth of that statement. "Scared about logistics and what comes next, but lighter without the weight of constantly trying to be enough for someone who was never going to value me anyway." The relief was physical as much as emotional, as if serving those divorce papers had released tension I'd been carrying in my shoulders and jaw for months without consciously recognizing it. We spent Saturday morning strategizing next steps while consuming impressive amounts of coffee and toast. Diane suggested I take a few days before attempting to retrieve belongings from the apartment, giving Brandon time to process the divorce filing and hopefully move past any initial rage or desperation that might make him difficult during the extraction process. In the meantime, I could start looking for my own place to live, something small and affordable that would give me independence without requiring financial support from anyone else. The idea of having an apartment that was entirely mine, decorated according to my preferences without compromise or criticism, felt exciting in ways I hadn't anticipated. I'd moved directly from my college apartment with Diane into living with Brandon, never experiencing the autonomy of solo living as an adult with an established career. The prospect of choosing furniture and paint colors and kitchen supplies based solely on my own taste rather than joint decision-making or Brandon's superior judgment felt like reclaiming agency I'd surrendered without fully realizing what I was giving up. Victoria Chen called mid-morning to check in and inform me that Brandon had already contacted her office through his own attorney. His response to the divorce filing had been swift, suggesting he'd spent part of Friday night consulting lawyers rather than sleeping. According to Victoria, Brandon's attorney was making noises about contesting some of the asset division terms, but nothing serious enough to derail the overall process. Just typical posturing to make himself feel in control of a situation where he clearly isn't, Victoria explained. "We'll respond appropriately and keep moving forward with dissolution proceedings." The news that Brandon had hired his own attorney felt validating rather than threatening. His quick legal response confirmed that he understood I was serious about ending the marriage, that Friday night's public filing wasn't dramatic gesture he could talk me down from with the right combination of apologies and promises. Whatever happened next would unfold through proper legal channels with advocates protecting both our interests, removing the emotional manipulation that had characterized too much of our relationship dynamics. Diane left for a previously scheduled lunch with her sister, leaving me alone in her apartment with instructions to treat it like my own space for as long as I needed. The silence felt peaceful rather than lonely, giving me time to process everything that had happened over the past week, from discovering Brandon's video call to serving divorce papers at the Sterling Room. My life had transformed completely in 7 days, shifting from struggling marriage I was desperately trying to save to legal dissolution I'd initiated with dramatic public flair. I finally retrieved my phone from where Diane had left it charging overnight. The screen showed 43 notifications, a mix of calls, texts, and voicemails from Brandon and various other people who apparently felt entitled to weigh in on my marriage decisions. I started with the text messages, wanting written documentation of anything that might constitute harassment before potentially blocking everyone except Victoria Chen and people I actually wanted to hear from. Brandon's messages followed a predictable arc from anger to bargaining to renewed anger when I didn't respond to his appeals. The early texts accused me of being dramatic and unreasonable, making rash decisions based on misunderstandings that could be cleared up through conversation. The middle messages pleaded for a chance to explain and promised he'd do whatever it took to fix our problems if I'd just agree to talk with him privately. The latest messages had shifted back to accusatory, claiming I'd humiliated him professionally and questioning whether I'd planned this whole scenario for maximum damage to his reputation. Monica's texts were less numerous but more pointed, scolding me for inappropriate behavior and demanding I consider how my actions affected Brandon's family beyond just our marriage. Her concerns seemed focused entirely on damage control rather than any acknowledgement that her brother might bear responsibility for the relationship's failure. Garrett had sent several messages that tried to play mediator, suggesting that both sides had valid points and encouraging me to meet with Brandon for closure even if reconciliation wasn't possible. His inability to simply support my decision without trying to manage the situation for Brandon's benefit felt typically self-serving. The most interesting message came from Vanessa Pierce, Brandon's co-worker who'd been at the dinner. Her text was brief and surprisingly supportive given how little we actually knew each other. I wanted you to know that several people at the table were uncomfortable with how Brandon talked about marriage last night even before you served the papers. What happened wasn't your fault, and you don't owe anyone explanations for protecting yourself. Her unexpected solidarity suggested that not everyone in Brandon's social circle agreed with his treatment of me or his reduction of marriage to transactional arrangement. I drafted a single response that I could send to multiple people, keeping it professional and non-emotional. I appreciate your concern, but this is a private matter that I'm handling through my attorney. Please direct any questions about the divorce proceedings to Victoria Chen at her office. Thank you for respecting my boundaries during this difficult transition. The template message felt appropriately distant while establishing clear limits about my willingness to engage with people who'd been part of Brandon's social world but not my genuine support system. The voicemails ranged from Brandon's emotional pleading to Monica's stern lectures to Garrett's well-meaning but ultimately self-interested attempts at mediation. I saved them all as Victoria had suggested, documentation of contact attempts that might become relevant if Brandon escalated to harassment or tried to paint me as unreasonable in legal proceedings. The sheer volume of communication attempts in less than 24 hours suggested a level of panic that felt proportional to how publicly I'd ended the marriage. Brandon was clearly more concerned about damage to his professional image than about losing me as a partner, which somehow made the decision to divorce feel even more correct. Sunday passed quietly at Diane's apartment with no additional communication from Brandon after I'd sent my boundary-setting response. Either he'd accepted that I wasn't going to engage in emotional discussions, or his attorney had advised him to limit contact to legal channels. Regardless of the reason, the silence felt like relief, giving me space to start processing what my life would look like moving forward rather than constantly defending my decision to people who'd already decided I was wrong. Monday morning meant returning to work at Hartwell and Associates, facing colleagues who might have heard about Friday night's dramatic dinner through Belmont's surprisingly interconnected professional networks. I dressed carefully in my most professional suit, wanting to project confidence and competence rather than appearing as devastated abandoned wife that Brandon's narrative probably positioned me as. Trish met me at the elevator with coffee and a knowing look that confirmed news had traveled through workplace channels over the weekend. The whole office knows something happened, Trish warned me as we rode up to our floor. Jennifer from accounting has a friend who was eating at the Sterling Room Friday night and apparently witnessed the whole thing. She told maybe 3 people in confidence, which means basically everyone knows you filed for divorce publicly. Her matter-of-fact delivery helped me prepare mentally for whatever attention or gossip might come my way throughout the workday. The reactions from coworkers ranged from sympathetic to admiring to awkwardly curious. Several people stopped by my desk to offer support or share their own divorce stories, creating an impromptu community of people who'd survived marriage dissolution and wanted me to know recovery was possible. A few seemed primarily interested in gossip details they could share with others, asking pointed questions about what led to such a dramatic public filing. I deflected those inquiries politely while appreciating that most people seemed genuinely concerned about my well-being rather than merely entertained by my personal drama. Leonard Foster called me into his office mid-morning, and I braced for potential professional consequences of my personal life becoming workplace gossip. Instead, he wanted to ensure I had support systems in place and offer flexibility with my schedule if I needed time for legal appointments or moving logistics. "Your work here has been consistently excellent," he said directly. "Whatever's happening in your personal life doesn't change my assessment of your professional value to this firm." His clear separation of my identity as employee from my status as divorcing wife felt affirming after years of Brandon conflating my worth across all life domains. The week progressed with a rhythm that felt almost normal despite how completely my life had changed. Work provided structure and purpose, giving me problems to solve that had clear answers, unlike the messy emotional territory of relationship dissolution. Evenings at Diane's apartment became comfortable routine, cooking together and watching television or reading without need for constant conversation. The simplicity of existing without judgment or evaluation felt healing in ways I hadn't anticipated, highlighting how much energy I'd been spending on managing Brandon's perception of me. Victoria Chen scheduled our first strategy session for Thursday afternoon, meeting at her office to review Brandon's attorney's formal response to the divorce filing and plan our counter-approach. Brandon was contesting my request to keep certain furniture pieces, claiming they were joint purchases despite being items I'd owned before marriage. His attorney had also raised questions about dividing our modest savings account, suggesting Brandon deserved larger portion based on his higher income contributions. The petty fighting over relatively insignificant assets suggested this process might be more contentious than Victoria had initially hoped, but nothing seemed insurmountable. The second week of living at Diane's apartment brought unexpected challenges that had nothing to do with Brandon or the divorce proceedings. My body decided to process all the accumulated stress and emotional upheaval through a series of physical symptoms that forced me to acknowledge I'd been running on adrenaline since discovering that video call. Headaches that wouldn't respond to over-the-counter medication plagued my mornings, and my sleep became fragmented despite the comfortable guest bed and Diane's quiet apartment. My appetite fluctuated wildly between eating everything in sight and feeling nauseous at the thought of food, creating an exhausting cycle that left me feeling disconnected from my own physical needs. Trish noticed during our Wednesday coffee run that I looked drawn and tired despite the concealer I'd carefully applied that morning. "You're trying to power through this like it's a project at work," she observed with her characteristic directness. "But divorce is trauma, Claire, even when it's the right decision. Your body is telling you to slow down and actually process what happened instead of just moving efficiently toward the next milestone." Her words hit harder than I'd expected, forcing me to recognize that I'd been treating my marriage's dissolution as a problem to be solved rather than a loss to be grieved. The truth was that even though Brandon had revealed himself to be someone who didn't value or respect me, I was still mourning the relationship I'd thought we had. The version of Brandon I'd fallen in love with, the man who'd seemed charming and attentive during our courtship, had never actually existed except as performance designed to secure a suitable wife. Accepting that reality meant acknowledging I'd spent 4 years loving someone who'd been playing a role while his authentic self harbored contempt for everything I was. That realization carried its own specific grief that wasn't resolved simply by filing legal paperwork and moving into a friend's spare bedroom. Diane suggested I consider talking to a therapist who specialized in recovery from emotionally abusive relationships. The word abuse still felt uncomfortable to apply to my marriage because Brandon had never yelled or hit me or engaged in the obvious dramatic behaviors I associated with the term. But Trish and now Diane both insisted that systematic devaluation, public humiliation disguised as jokes, and the constant message that I should be grateful for his tolerance all qualified as emotional abuse regardless of how subtle the delivery had been. The therapist Diane recommended, Dr. Patricia Holloway, had availability for a consultation the following week. Work continued to be my refuge from the chaos of personal life reorganization. Leonard Foster assigned me to lead a new client project that would require coordinating multiple departments and presenting findings directly to Hartwell and Associates senior partners. The opportunity felt significant, exactly the kind of professional advancement I'd been working toward but had somehow stopped believing I deserved during my marriage. Brandon's constant subtle messaging about my career being adequate but unimpressive had convinced me that leadership positions were beyond my capabilities, that I should be satisfied with competent completion of assigned tasks rather than aspiring to increased responsibility. The project involved analyzing financial inefficiencies for a manufacturing company considering expansion into new markets. My team included Trish and 2 analysts from different departments, all of whom treated me with professional respect that felt revolutionary after years of Brandon's dismissiveness. During our first planning meeting, I presented preliminary ideas and received engaged feedback that built on my suggestions rather than undermining them. The collaborative environment reminded me of how work relationships could function when people actually valued each other's contributions instead of constantly jockeying for superior position. My phone continued receiving periodic messages from Brandon despite my request that all communication go through attorneys. The messages had shifted away from anger or pleading toward a new strategy that involved nostalgia and selective memory. He sent photos from our early relationship, reminding me of trips we'd taken and moments that had seemed happy before I understood they were performances rather than genuine connection. "Do you remember how good we were together?" one message asked, accompanied by a picture from our honeymoon in Charleston. "We can get back to that if you'll just give us another chance." The photographs should have triggered warm feelings or at least some sadness about what we'd lost. Instead, I looked at my younger self in those images and saw someone who'd been slowly losing her sense of identity while believing she was building a partnership. The woman in the Charleston photo smiled brightly, but her eyes held a careful quality I recognized now, the constant awareness of being evaluated and the effort to present the version of herself that would earn approval. Even during our honeymoon, I'd been performing rather than simply being, monitoring my behavior to ensure I met whatever unstated standards Brandon was measuring me against. I forwarded the messages to Victoria Chen as documentation of continued contact despite clear boundaries, then blocked Brandon's number entirely. The decision felt both liberating and frightening, cutting off a communication channel that had been constant for 4 years even as it became increasingly toxic. Victoria assured me during our phone call that blocking him was entirely appropriate and actually strengthened our position by demonstrating that I'd made reasonable attempts to maintain boundaries he repeatedly violated. "If he needs to reach you about legitimate divorce logistics, he can contact me directly," she confirmed. The apartment search consumed my free time over the next several days. Belmont's rental market was competitive and expensive, requiring me to adjust my expectations about what I could afford on my salary alone without Brandon's higher income to supplement household expenses. The places I could manage financially were smaller and less centrally located than our current apartment, often in buildings that showed their age through outdated fixtures and worn carpeting. Each viewing reminded me of how much I'd relied on Brandon's earnings to maintain our lifestyle, though I was slowly recognizing that the financial comfort hadn't been worth the emotional cost. I found a 1-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood called Riverside Park, about 20 minutes from my office and close to the trail system that ran along the water. The unit was on the 3rd floor of a converted warehouse building, with exposed brick walls and large windows that let in natural light throughout the day. The kitchen was tiny and the bathroom fixtures definitely needed updating, but something about the space felt right in a way our carefully decorated apartment with Brandon never had. This place was mine alone to shape according to my preferences without compromise or judgment about my choices. The landlord, an older woman named Ruth Chin, seemed more interested in finding reliable tenants than maximizing rental income. She asked thoughtful questions about my employment and reasons for moving, listening carefully when I explained I was going through divorce and needed a fresh start in a space that felt safe and independent. "I can tell you're someone who'll take care of the place and respect the community here," Ruth said after showing me around the building's amenities. "The unit is yours if you want it. First month and security deposit will get you keys by the end of next week." Signing the lease felt like planting a flag in my new reality, claiming physical space that represented my life moving forward without Brandon or his family's influence. The apartment would be empty except for whatever furniture I could retrieve from storage or purchase secondhand, but that emptiness felt like possibility rather than lack. I could build a home that reflected who I actually was instead of who I'd been trying to become to earn Brandon's approval. The thought of decorating without worrying whether my choices would be mocked or dismissed made the small space feel larger and more welcoming than anywhere I'd lived during my marriage. Diane threw an impromptu celebration that evening when I told her about the lease signing, breaking out champagne she'd been saving for special occasions and ordering pizza from the place that made the overly greasy versions Brandon had always refused to eat because they didn't meet his standards for quality ingredients. We ate directly from the box while sitting on her living room floor, laughing about nothing in particular and everything at once. "This feels like college again," Diane observed happily. "Back when we stayed up too late and made questionable decisions but always supported each other through whatever happened." The comparison made me realize how much I'd missed having uncomplicated friendship in my life. Brandon had been critical of Diane from early in our relationship, suggesting her spontaneity was actually lack of maturity and her creative career was less serious than professional work in corporate environments. His subtle disapproval had led me to see her less frequently over the years, choosing to avoid conflict rather than defend my friend against judgments she didn't deserve. Now, sitting on her floor eating pizza she'd ordered specifically because she knew I enjoyed it, I recognized how much I'd sacrificed trying to maintain peace with someone who was never going to value the things and people I cared about. The weekend brought the task I'd been dreading since filing for divorce. Retrieving my belongings from the apartment required coordination with Brandon to ensure we weren't there simultaneously, avoiding potential confrontation that could derail the relatively civil divorce proceedings. Victoria Chen had communicated with his attorney to establish a schedule where I'd have Saturday afternoon to collect my items while Brandon stayed elsewhere. Diane recruited 2 other friends to help with the physical labor of moving, both of them women who'd been part of our college friend group but whom I'd drifted away from during marriage. Arriving at the apartment building felt surreal, like visiting a place I'd lived in a previous life rather than just 3 weeks earlier. The familiar lobby and elevator ride to our floor carried none of the sense of homecoming I'd once felt returning here after work trips or long days at the office. This was simply a location where I needed to retrieve my property, nothing more significant than that. Diane kept up steady conversation during the elevator ride, probably trying to distract me from whatever emotions might surface when I walked through the door into space so thoroughly associated with my failed marriage. Brandon had left the apartment unlocked as agreed, but his absence felt somehow more oppressive than his physical presence would have been. Evidence of his life continuing without me scattered throughout the rooms showed he was managing fine with the separation. Dishes sat in the sink from meals he'd eaten alone, his work papers spread across the dining table we'd picked out together, his jacket hung over the chair where he always left it when coming home from the office. The apartment looked lived in rather than abandoned, highlighting that my departure had disrupted his routine but hadn't devastated him the way losing him might once have destroyed me. My friends moved through the space efficiently, following my directions about which items were mine to take and which belonged to Brandon or should be left because they weren't worth fighting over. The furniture we'd purchased together mostly stayed because I had no way to transport large pieces and no space in my new apartment for a couch that seated 5 people. Kitchen items I'd brought into the marriage went into boxes, along with books from shelves that had held more of Brandon's business titles than my novels and poetry collections. Clothes packed quickly once I accepted that some items could be left behind, donations to charity rather than reminders of who I'd been trying to become. The bedroom felt most difficult to navigate because it held so many memories of intimacy that had apparently meant different things to each of us. I believed our physical connection was evidence of genuine affection and desire, while Brandon had apparently viewed it as obligation or transaction in his expensive roommate arrangement with occasional benefits. Packing my nightstand contents and toiletries from the bathroom required confronting how completely I'd been deceived about the nature of our relationship, how thoroughly his performance had convinced me we were building something real and valuable. Diane found me sitting on the bathroom floor at one point, staring at nothing while holding a bottle of the perfume Brandon had given me for our 2nd anniversary. "You don't have to take things that carry bad memories," she said gently, sitting beside me on the tile floor. "Leave behind anything that makes you feel worse rather than better." Her permission to abandon items that represented my marriage rather than my individual identity felt freeing, allowing me to be selective about what I carried forward into my new life. We finished packing by late afternoon, loading my car and Diane's truck with boxes and bags that represented 4 years of accumulated belongings. The apartment looked emptier but not dramatically changed, evidence that I'd already been disappearing from this space long before I filed for divorce. Brandon's possessions dominated the rooms now without my items to balance them, reflecting how the relationship had always centered his preferences and priorities over mine. Leaving felt like exhaling after holding my breath for years, releasing tension I hadn't fully recognized I'd been carrying. I left my key on the kitchen counter beside a brief note confirming I'd retrieved my belongings and wouldn't be returning. The formality felt appropriate, marking this as completed transaction rather than emotional goodbye. This apartment had never really been home despite living here throughout my marriage. Home was supposed to be a place where you felt safe and valued, where you could be fully yourself without performance or pretense. That definition hadn't described this space since shortly after we'd moved in together, if it ever had. The drive to my new apartment in Riverside Park felt like crossing a border into different country where different rules applied and different possibilities existed. My friends helped carry boxes up 3 flights of stairs, filling the empty apartment with my belongings that suddenly seemed insufficient for the space. The bare walls and absence of furniture highlighted how much I needed to acquire to make this place functional, but the challenge felt exciting rather than overwhelming. Every item I chose for this space would reflect my actual taste rather than compromise with Brandon's supposedly superior judgment. We ordered Chinese food and ate sitting on the floor of my empty living room, fortune cookies providing entertainment as we read ridiculous predictions and laughed at their vague optimism. "Your future holds great happiness and success," mine proclaimed, which felt either prophetic or completely meaningless depending on how seriously you took Cookie's ability to predict life outcomes. Regardless, the message created a moment of hope that maybe life after Brandon really would be better than the relationship I'd worked so hard to preserve. My friends left as evening darkened into night, leaving me alone in my new apartment for the first time. The silence felt different than it had at Diane's place because this quiet belonged entirely to me rather than being temporary refuge in someone else's space. I could make noise or stay silent, play music or sit in peace, eat cereal for dinner or cook elaborate meals, all without considering anyone else's preferences or potential criticism. The autonomy felt both liberating and slightly terrifying, requiring me to remember who I was when not constantly adjusting to meet someone else's expectations. Sleep came easier that first night in my own apartment than it had in weeks. The borrowed air mattress from Diane wasn't particularly comfortable, but something about knowing this space was mine alone allowed me to relax in ways I hadn't managed even in theoretically safe locations. My unconscious mind seemed to recognize that I'd established real independence rather than just temporary separation, creating foundation for recovery that went beyond legal dissolution of marriage. Sunday morning brought the challenge of making coffee in a kitchen that had almost no supplies or equipment yet. I'd taken basics from the old apartment but hadn't thought to verify I had everything necessary for morning routines. The process of discovering what I needed and didn't have felt like treasure hunt, making lists of items to acquire and prioritizing based on what would make the apartment functional versus what could wait until I'd rebuilt my savings after divorce expenses. The first grocery shopping trip as a single person required adjustment to cooking for one instead of planning meals that would feed 2 people. I found myself automatically reaching for items Brandon had preferred before consciously choosing alternatives I actually enjoyed but had stopped buying to avoid his subtle disapproval. The cart filled with foods that were too spicy or too sweet or too whatever Brandon had decided made them inferior choices according to his sophisticated palate. Loading groceries into my empty refrigerator felt like small rebellion against years of accommodating preferences that had been presented as objectively correct rather than merely personal taste. My first therapy appointment with Dr. Patricia Holloway was scheduled for Monday afternoon, requiring me to leave work early and navigate to her office in an unfamiliar part of Belmont. The waiting room was decorated in soothing neutrals with abstract art that probably cost more than my monthly rent, creating atmosphere of expensive professional competence. Other patients sat reading magazines or checking phones, all of us waiting to discuss our various psychological struggles with someone trained to help us process and heal. Dr. Holloway was younger than I'd expected, maybe early 40s, with warm brown eyes and a direct manner that reminded me of Trish. She asked me to explain what brought me to therapy, and I found myself recounting the entire story from discovering Brandon's video call through serving divorce papers at the Sterling Room. The narrative had become smoother through repeated telling, but saying everything out loud to someone whose job was analyzing human behavior made me hear my own story differently. The pattern of subtle control and systematic devaluation seemed more obvious when laid out chronologically for someone trained to identify abusive dynamics. "What you're describing is a textbook case of covert emotional abuse," Dr. Holloway said when I'd finished the overview. Your husband systematically undermined your confidence while presenting himself as reasonable and you as overly sensitive or demanding. The public mockery of your relationship to others while maintaining a false narrative with you is particularly damaging because it makes you question your own perception of reality. Her clinical assessment felt validating even as it hurt to have my marriage officially categorized as abusive relationship rather than simply difficult partnership. We spent the remainder of the session discussing my tendency to accommodate others' needs while minimizing my own, a pattern Dr. Holloway suggested probably predated my marriage to Brandon. She asked about my family of origin and early relationships, gently probing for experiences that might have taught me my value was contingent on meeting others' expectations. The questions felt uncomfortable because they required admitting that Brandon hadn't been the first person whose approval I'd sought through constant adjustment of my authentic self. He'd simply been the most successful at exploiting vulnerabilities I'd been carrying long before we met. Your homework for the next week is to notice when you're changing your behavior or opinions to accommodate someone else's comfort, Dr. Holloway instructed as our time concluded. Not to judge yourself for it, just to observe the pattern and become conscious of how automatic it's become. She explained that healing from emotional abuse required first recognizing how thoroughly it had shaped my thoughts and behaviors, then slowly learning to trust my own judgment and preferences over other people's reactions. The assignment sounded simple but proved challenging as soon as I returned to work. I noticed myself agreeing to take on extra tasks because saying no might disappoint Leonard even though my current workload was already full. I caught myself editing opinions in meetings to sound less assertive or definitive because strong statements might be perceived as aggressive or difficult. I recognized patterns of apologizing for things that didn't warrant apology, like asking a coworker to repeat something I hadn't heard clearly or requesting minor schedule adjustments for legitimate reasons. The constant accommodation had become so ingrained I didn't consciously register doing it anymore. Trish became my accountability partner for the homework assignment, gently pointing out when I was diminishing myself in ways I didn't notice. During a client presentation later that week, she interrupted me mid-apology for technical difficulties that weren't my responsibility to acknowledge. You didn't cause the projector malfunction, she said matter-of-factly. Stop apologizing for things that aren't your fault. The client laughed good-naturedly and the presentation continued, but I'd been jarred into awareness of how reflexively I accepted blame to smooth over any disruption regardless of my actual culpability. The project Leonard had assigned me was progressing well despite my personal life chaos. The preliminary analysis revealed significant inefficiencies in the client's supply chain management and inventory systems, problems that could be addressed through relatively straightforward restructuring and technology upgrades. My team had worked cohesively to gather data and develop recommendations, making the process feel collaborative rather than hierarchical. Presenting our initial findings to the client's executive team was scheduled for the following month, giving me a professional milestone to focus on beyond divorce proceedings. Victoria Chin called midweek with news that Brandon's attorney had backed down from most of the contested asset division issues. Apparently your ex-husband has been advised that fighting over furniture and small savings account makes him look petty rather than principled, she explained with amusement in her voice. We've reached agreement on division that's equitable and lets us move forward with finalizing everything. The judge should approve our settlement within 6 weeks, maybe sooner if the court schedule cooperates. Her confidence that the legal process was progressing smoothly felt reassuring, marking clear timeline for when my marriage would be officially dissolved rather than just practically over. The apartment slowly became more functional as I acquired furniture from secondhand stores and accepted donations from friends who had items to spare. Diane contributed a bookshelf she'd been storing in her garage, and Trish gave me kitchen equipment she'd duplicated when moving in with her current partner. The accumulated pieces didn't match in style or quality, creating eclectic aesthetic that somehow felt more authentic than the carefully coordinated apartment Brandon and I had maintained. This space looked lived in and personal rather than magazine-ready, reflecting actual human inhabitation rather than performance of successful domestic life. I started a routine of evening walks along the Riverside Trail near my apartment building, using the physical activity to process lingering emotions and slowly rebuild connection with my own body. The exercise felt different than workouts I'd done during my marriage, which had been motivated by appearance concerns and Brandon's subtle suggestions that I should maintain certain physical standards. These walks were purely for mental health and the pleasure of movement, without any agenda beyond spending time outside and letting my mind wander through thoughts without judgment. Other trail users became familiar presences even though we rarely exchanged more than polite nods or brief greetings. An elderly couple who walked hand in hand every evening regardless of weather, a woman training an enthusiastic golden retriever, a man who jogged while listening to music through headphones so loud I could hear the beat from several feet away. These strangers formed accidental community bound by shared space and routine, all of us pursuing our own reasons for being outside in the liminal hours between work and sleep. My second therapy session focused on identifying my core values separate from what I'd been taught to value by family, culture, or romantic partners. Dr. Holloway asked me to list things that mattered to me without considering whether they were impressive or appropriate or aligned with others' expectations. The exercise proved harder than it should have been, revealing how thoroughly I'd absorbed external definitions of success and worth rather than developing clear internal compass. I found myself listing vague concepts like kindness and honesty that could have come from anyone rather than specific values that reflected my particular personality and experiences. Dr. Holloway pushed me to get more specific and personal. "What kind of kindness matters to you?" she asked. "What does honesty mean in your specific context?" Her questions forced me deeper into self-examination than I'd gone in years, maybe ever. I realized I valued creativity and artistic expression even though Brandon had dismissed those interests as hobbies rather than serious pursuits. I recognized that justice and fairness were core motivators for me, explaining my strong reactions to situations where people were treated inequitably. I acknowledged that I needed solitude and quiet to recharge, contradicting Brandon's insistence that my preference for limited social activity indicated something wrong with me rather than legitimate personality trait. The session ended with an assignment to spend time doing something purely for my own enjoyment without productivity or improvement as justification. Just pleasure, Dr. Holloway emphasized. Something you do because it feels good, not because it makes you better or more accomplished. The instruction felt almost transgressive given how thoroughly I'd been trained to justify my activities through their utility or contribution to some larger goal. Doing something merely because I enjoyed it seemed frivolous and potentially selfish, which Dr. Holloway pointed out was exactly why the assignment was important for my recovery. I chose to spend Saturday afternoon at Belmont's Art Museum, wandering through galleries without agenda or educational purpose. The Impressionist collection drew me in with its emphasis on light and color over precise representation, paintings that captured feeling rather than accurate documentation. I stood in front of a Monet for longer than was probably socially appropriate, getting lost in the brushstrokes and the way individual marks dissolved into coherent image when viewed from proper distance. The experience felt meditative and nourishing in ways I'd forgotten were possible, filling something in me that had been depleted through years of utilitarian living. The following week brought unexpected contact from someone I'd never anticipated hearing from again. Vanessa Pierce, Brandon's coworker who'd been at the Sterling Room dinner, sent me a message through a professional networking platform where we'd been loosely connected. Her message was carefully worded but direct, asking if I'd be willing to meet for coffee to discuss something that had been weighing on her conscience since that evening. The request felt strange given how little we actually knew each other, but something about the sincerity in her phrasing made me curious enough to agree. We met at a cafe in the business district on Thursday afternoon, both of us taking late lunch breaks from our respective offices. Vanessa looked professional and polished as always, her dark suit impeccable and her briefcase suggesting she'd come directly from client meetings. She ordered an Americano and got straight to the point once we'd settled at a corner table away from other customers. "I need to tell you something about Brandon that I should have said years ago," she began, her discomfort obvious in how she gripped her coffee cup. "I've known about his behavior toward you for a long time, and I did nothing to stop it or warn you. That makes me complicit in how he treated you." Her admission caught me completely off guard. I'd assumed Vanessa was part of Brandon's inner circle, someone who shared his views about marriage and relationships and probably agreed with his assessment of me as adequate but unremarkable. The idea that she'd been uncomfortable with his treatment but stayed silent introduced complexity I wasn't prepared to process. I waited for her to continue, unsure what response she expected or deserved from me. "Brandon talks about you constantly at work," Vanessa continued, her voice low despite our relative privacy. "Not in ways anyone would report to human resources because he's too smart for obvious violations, but constantly undermining you in small comments and jokes. He'd make fun of your career, your interests, your appearance, always framed as affectionate teasing so anyone who objected would seem oversensitive. I watched him systematically destroy your reputation among our colleagues while presenting himself as the patient husband dealing with a difficult wife. The revelation felt like discovering another layer of betrayal beneath what I'd already uncovered. I'd known Brandon mocked me to strangers during video calls and to his friends at social gatherings, but learning he'd been running the same campaign at his workplace where I'd never have any chance to defend myself or correct his narratives cut deeper than I'd expected. These were people who would only ever know me through Brandon's distorted characterization, forming opinions about someone they'd never met based entirely on his calculated cruelty. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked, hearing my voice come out harder than intended. "What do you want from me? Absolution for staying silent while you watched him tear me down to people who never even gave me a chance to be anything other than his version of inadequate?" My anger surprised both of us, bubbling up from somewhere I hadn't realized it existed. Vanessa had the grace to look ashamed rather than defensive, accepting my reaction as deserved consequence of her complicity. "I don't want absolution," she said quietly. "I want you to know that his behavior at work has gotten worse since you filed for divorce, and several people have started documenting his comments about you. We're building a case for hostile work environment because his obsession with publicly degrading you has crossed lines that make other women in the office uncomfortable." Her explanation shifted my understanding of why she'd reached out, moving from personal guilt to practical warning about Brandon's escalating conduct. Vanessa explained that Brandon had spent the weeks since our separation alternating between playing the wronged husband whose wife abandoned him without cause, and making increasingly crude jokes about my supposed inadequacies as partner. He'd shared details about our intimate life that violated basic privacy boundaries, making other employees uncomfortable with his oversharing. He'd mocked my career repeatedly, suggesting I'd never been intellectually capable of anything beyond basic accounting work. His campaign had become so pervasive that multiple co-workers had complained to management about creating an uncomfortable work environment. "The company is taking it seriously because they're worried about liability," Vanessa continued. "If you decided to pursue legal action for defamation or harassment, Brandon's workplace conduct would be relevant evidence. I wanted you to know that documentation exists if you need it, and that there are people at Pinnacle Group who recognize his behavior is unacceptable regardless of his professional performance." Her offer felt both helpful and overwhelming, introducing legal possibilities I hadn't considered because I'd been focused solely on finalizing divorce rather than pursuing additional claims against Brandon. I thanked her for the information and promised to discuss it with Victoria Chen, though I wasn't certain I wanted to extend my legal entanglement with Brandon beyond the divorce proceedings. Part of me wanted documentation of his workplace harassment to validate my experience and potentially protect future partners from similar treatment. Another part just wanted clean separation without additional months of litigation and public examination of my private life. The decision didn't need to be made immediately, which gave me time to process what Vanessa had revealed and consider whether pursuing action served my healing or just prolonged my connection to someone I was trying to move beyond. Vanessa left our coffee meeting looking slightly less burdened, as if confessing her complicity had transferred some weight from her shoulders to mine. I sat alone at the table after she departed, watching business professionals hurry past the cafe windows on their way to meetings and appointments that mattered only within their immediate contexts. Brandon had spent our entire marriage ensuring his colleagues saw me through lens of his contempt, building narrative about my inadequacy that those people probably still believed despite my absence from their direct experience. The injustice of it burned in my chest, rage at how thoroughly he'd worked to destroy my reputation among people I'd never have opportunity to prove wrong. I forwarded Vanessa's contact information to Victoria Chen with brief explanation of what she'd shared. My attorney responded within hours, her message reflecting calculated interest in potential additional claims we could pursue. "Evidence of workplace harassment strengthens your position if Brandon tries to contest any remaining divorce terms," Victoria wrote. "It also gives us leverage if he attempts to drag out proceedings or create difficulties around asset division. Even if you choose not to file separate harassment claims, having documentation available is strategically valuable." Her practical assessment helped me see the information as tool rather than obligation, something I could deploy if necessary without requiring immediate action. The weekend brought my parents' first visit to my new apartment, a meeting I'd been simultaneously anticipating and dreading since signing the lease. My mother had been vocally disappointed about the divorce, not because she particularly liked Brandon but because she valued the social stability marriage represented. My father had been quieter in his reactions, asking practical questions about my finances and housing situation without offering opinions about the relationship's failure. Their visit would reveal whether they could support my decision or would spend the afternoon suggesting ways I might have tried harder to save my marriage. They arrived Saturday morning with groceries and cleaning supplies, my mother's default response to any life crisis being to feed people and organize their living spaces. She moved through my small apartment with obvious dismay at the mismatched furniture and bare walls, making comments about how much nicer my previous place had been and whether I'd considered what I was giving up by ending my marriage. Her criticism felt exhausting rather than hurtful, so predictable that I'd mentally prepared responses during the drive over from their house in the suburbs. My father pulled me aside while my mother rearranged my kitchen cabinets according to principles of efficiency I hadn't asked for. "Are you doing okay financially?" he asked directly, his concern focused on practical realities rather than emotional processing. "I can help with first few months if the divorce expenses have strained your budget." His offer touched me more than I'd expected, cutting through my mother's performative disappointment to address actual material concerns. I assured him I was managing adequately on my salary alone, though I appreciated knowing support existed if circumstances changed. Lunch was uncomfortable but survivable, my mother cycling through topics that all somehow circled back to questioning my decision to divorce. Had I really tried everything to save the marriage? Was I certain I wouldn't regret walking away when I got older and realized how difficult finding another partner would become? Did I understand how much harder life was as single woman compared to married couple? Her questions revealed assumptions about my priorities and capabilities that I'd spent years trying to disprove, old narratives about women's value being tied to relationship status rather than individual accomplishment. I finally interrupted her litany of concerns with direct statement about Brandon's treatment during our marriage. "He mocked me constantly to his coworkers and friends," I said clearly. "He told people I was adequate at best and that he'd settled for me when better options didn't materialize. He reduced our marriage to expensive roommate situation and made jokes about managing his disappointment at my limitations. That's not a relationship worth saving regardless of how convenient staying married might be." The silence that followed my declaration was heavy and uncomfortable. My mother looked genuinely shocked, as if the possibility that Brandon might have been cruel had never occurred to her despite my vague explanations about why the marriage had failed. My father's expression darkened with anger I'd rarely seen directed at anyone outside immediate family. "If he spoke about you that way," my father said slowly, "then you made the right choice leaving. No one deserves to be with someone who treats them like they're lucky to be tolerated." The validation from my father meant more than I'd anticipated, confirming that at least one parent understood my decision stemmed from legitimate mistreatment rather than impulsive rejection of perfectly acceptable marriage. My mother took longer to process, her worldview requiring adjustment to accommodate the idea that maintaining relationship wasn't always preferable to being alone. By the time they left that afternoon, she'd softened enough to admit that perhaps I knew what was best for my situation even if it wasn't the choice she'd have made. The client presentation for my project at Hartwell & Associates was scheduled for the following Tuesday, representing significant professional opportunity regardless of how my personal life had imploded. My team had prepared comprehensive analysis of the manufacturing company's inefficiencies along with detailed recommendations for restructuring their supply chain and inventory management systems. The presentation materials looked polished and professional, reflecting weeks of collaborative work that I was genuinely proud of independent of its potential impact on my career trajectory. Leonard Foster scheduled a practice run-through on Monday afternoon, gathering several senior partners to provide feedback on our approach and delivery. I'd presented to internal audiences before but never to this level of firm leadership, and my nerves showed in how quickly I spoke through the early slides. Leonard interrupted gently to remind me to slow down and make eye contact with the audience rather than reading from notes. "Your analysis is excellent," he said encouragingly. "Trust that the work speaks for itself and focus on engaging the people in the room rather than performing perfection." His feedback helped me adjust my approach for the actual client presentation, remembering that my goal was communication rather than flawless execution. The manufacturing company's executives listened attentively as I walked through our findings, asking thoughtful questions that suggested genuine engagement with the material. Trish handled the technical details of our proposed inventory system with impressive clarity, while the analysts fielded questions about implementation timeline and resource requirements. The presentation concluded with the client's CEO thanking us for thorough analysis and promising to review our recommendations with her leadership team. The positive reception felt validating in ways I desperately needed given how much of my identity had been undermined during my marriage. Brandon had spent years suggesting my work was adequate but unimpressive, that my contributions to any team were competent completion of assigned tasks rather than innovative thinking or leadership capability. Successfully leading this project contradicted his narrative about my limitations, proving to myself if no one else that I was capable of professional achievement beyond what he deemed me worthy of attempting. Leonard called me into his office the day after the presentation with news that surprised and delighted me. "The client was extremely impressed with your team's analysis," he said with genuine pleasure. "They've specifically requested that you lead the implementation phase of the recommended changes, which would mean regular travel to their facilities and direct reporting to their executive team. It's a significant expansion of your role here and would come with compensation adjustment to reflect the increased responsibility." The opportunity felt almost too perfectly timed, arriving exactly when I needed proof that my professional value existed independent of Brandon's assessment. The promotion would require occasional overnight trips to the client's manufacturing facilities, which were located about 3 hours north of Belmont in smaller industrial city. The travel represented both challenge and opportunity, forcing me out of comfortable routines while proving I could handle complex logistical and professional demands. I accepted immediately, recognizing that this role would cement my reputation within Hartwell and Associates as someone capable of managing major client relationships rather than just supporting other people's projects. Telling Dr. Holloway about the promotion during my next therapy session revealed how much I'd internalized Brandon's diminishment of my capabilities. I found myself minimizing the achievement, suggesting it was lucky timing or that the client probably would have been satisfied with anyone Leonard assigned. Dr. Holloway stopped me mid-rationalization with direct challenge to my automatic self-deprecation. "You led a team that produced excellent work," she said firmly. "You presented that work professionally and compellingly. The client valued your contribution enough to request you specifically for implementation. Those are facts, not luck or accident. Can you acknowledge that you earned this opportunity?" The question forced me to sit with discomfort of claiming my own accomplishment without qualification or deflection. "I earned this promotion," I said slowly, testing how the words felt. "My analysis was thorough and my presentation was effective. The client chose me because I demonstrated capability they value." Speaking the simple truth out loud felt revolutionary after years of accepting Brandon's message that my professional success was despite rather than because of my actual abilities. Dr. Holloway smiled with obvious satisfaction at my willingness to claim achievement without minimizing it. "That's exactly the kind of reframing we're working toward," she confirmed. "Learning to recognize your own worth without requiring external validation or filtering it through someone else's judgment. Your ex-husband's opinion about your capabilities was never accurate assessment, it was strategic undermining designed to keep you dependent on his approval. Separating his lies from your reality is essential for building genuine self-confidence." The divorce finalization hearing was scheduled for early November, about 6 weeks after I'd served Brandon the papers at the Sterling Room. Victoria Chin explained that the hearing would be brief formality given that we'd reached agreement on all contested issues. The judge would review our settlement terms, confirm both parties consented to dissolution, and issue final decree ending our marriage legally. Brandon and I would both need to be present but wouldn't be required to speak beyond confirming our agreement, minimizing opportunity for dramatic confrontation or last-minute complications. I bought a new suit for the hearing, wanting to present myself as professional and composed rather than emotionally devastated by marriage's end. The navy fabric felt like armor, creating visual barrier between my vulnerable internal state and the public performance required by legal proceedings. Diane offered to accompany me for moral support, but I declined, recognizing that facing this milestone alone would prove something important to myself about my capability for independent navigation of difficult situations. The courthouse was busy on the November morning of my hearing, filled with people managing various legal matters from traffic violations to criminal proceedings. The family court section occupied the third floor, accessible through security screening that felt oddly theatrical given how mundane most cases probably were. I found Victoria Chin waiting near the courtroom entrance, her professional demeanor reassuring after weeks of communication primarily through email and phone calls. She reviewed what to expect one final time, emphasizing that the process would be straightforward and anticlimactic compared to how emotionally significant it felt to me personally. Brandon arrived 10 minutes before our scheduled time, accompanied by his attorney whose expensive suit probably cost more than my monthly rent. We didn't speak or make eye contact, both of us maintaining careful distance while we waited for the previous case to conclude. His presence felt strange rather than painful. This person I'd been married to for 4 years suddenly reduced to legal adversary in dissolution proceedings. I tried to find some emotion about seeing him for the first time since serving the divorce papers, but felt only mild curiosity about whether he looked different or showed signs of being affected by our separation. The hearing itself lasted less than 20 minutes. The judge reviewed our settlement agreement with practiced efficiency, confirming that both parties had legal representation and understood the terms we were agreeing to. She asked standard questions about whether either party was being coerced or felt pressured into accepting terms we didn't truly consent to. Brandon and I both answered appropriately, our voices flat and formal in the ceremonial space. The judge signed the decree dissolving our marriage, handed copies to our respective attorneys, and moved on to the next case on her docket without acknowledging the significance of what had just occurred. Walking out of the courthouse as legally single person felt surreal and anticlimactic. 4 years of marriage ended with administrative efficiency, reduced to signatures on legal documents that would be filed away in government records. No dramatic closure or final confrontation, just bureaucratic acknowledgement that a relationship had existed and now didn't. Victoria shook my hand and congratulated me on completing the process, reminding me to contact her if any issues arose around asset division or if I decided to pursue the workplace harassment claims Vanessa had mentioned. I sat in my car in the courthouse parking garage for a long time after the hearing, trying to process what felt like inadequate conclusion to such significant chapter of my life. Part of me had expected to feel more relief or joy or something recognizable as positive emotion about being free from marriage that had slowly destroyed my sense of self-worth. Instead, I felt oddly empty, as if the ending I'd fought so hard for had arrived without providing the transformation I'd hoped it would trigger automatically. Dr. Holloway had warned me during our last session that divorce finalization often felt disappointing rather than triumphant because legal dissolution didn't instantly heal emotional damage accumulated during years of harmful relationship. You're expecting the decree to magically restore the confidence and sense of self that Brandon systematically dismantled, she'd explained. But healing is a process that happens gradually through consistent work, not instant transformation that arrives with judge's signature. Her realistic framing helped me recognize that today was milestone rather than destination, marking progress without pretending the journey toward genuine recovery was complete. I drove to Riverside Park and walked the trail for hours, letting my body move while my mind processed the finality of what had just occurred in that courthouse. My marriage was legally over. Brandon was officially my ex-husband rather than my current partner. I was divorced at 32, single again after believing I'd found permanent life partnership. The facts were simple and clear, even if my emotional response to them remained complicated and unresolved. Other trail users passed me during my extended walk, the familiar regulars and new faces I didn't recognize. The elderly couple who walked hand in hand every evening smiled warmly when we crossed paths, and I wondered what their story was, whether they'd weathered difficulties or found each other late in life or simply been lucky enough to build genuine partnership from the beginning. The woman with the golden retriever stopped to let me pet her enthusiastic dog, offering the kind of uncomplicated interaction that felt grounding after the morning's legal formality. Diane called that evening to check how I was feeling after the hearing. I'm okay, I told her honestly. Not celebrating or falling apart, just okay. Processing that something major happened even though it felt weirdly mundane. Her understanding response confirmed she got it, that divorce finalization could be both momentous and ordinary depending on which angle you examined it from. We made plans for dinner over the weekend, her way of ensuring I wasn't spending too much time alone with thoughts that might spiral into unhealthy patterns. The weeks following divorce finalization settled into new rhythm that felt increasingly stable. Work consumed significant energy as I began traveling to the client's manufacturing facilities to oversee implementation of our recommended changes. The overnight trips felt liberating rather than burdensome, giving me legitimate reason to be away from Belmont and the routines that still occasionally reminded me of my failed marriage. The client's team treated me with professional respect that contrasted sharply with how Brandon had diminished my work, reinforcing that his assessment of my capabilities had been distortion rather than accurate evaluation. My apartment gradually transformed from temporary landing space into actual home as I acquired furniture and decorated according to my preferences. I painted the bedroom a soft sage green that Brandon would have criticized as unsophisticated but that I found calming and restorative. I hung art I'd collected from local galleries and craft fairs, pieces that reflected my aesthetic rather than carefully curated image appropriate for entertaining Brandon's colleagues. The space became refuge that felt genuinely mine, place where I could exist without performance or awareness of being evaluated against impossible standards. Therapy with Dr. Holloway continued weekly. Our sessions focused on identifying patterns of thought and behavior that had been shaped by emotional abuse and consciously choosing different approaches. We worked on distinguishing my authentic preferences from what I'd been taught to prefer by people who used approval as control mechanism. We practiced setting boundaries and articulating my needs directly rather than hinting and hoping others would intuit what I wanted. The work was slower and more difficult than I'd anticipated, requiring constant vigilance about old habits that reasserted themselves whenever I felt stressed or uncertain. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I ran into Brandon at a professional conference in downtown Belmont. The encounter was inevitable given our overlapping industries, though I'd managed to avoid him completely since walking out of that courthouse. He looked older somehow, the confidence that had once seemed attractive now reading as arrogance tinged with desperation. He approached me during the networking reception, his smile uncertain in ways I'd never seen when we were married. "You look good," he said awkwardly, gesturing at my outfit as if commenting on my appearance would bridge the months of silence between us. "I heard about your promotion and the manufacturing project. Sounds like things are going well professionally." His attempt at casual conversation felt forced and uncomfortable, revealing that he had no idea how to interact with me now that I wasn't his wife performing constant accommodation of his needs and preferences. "Things are going very well," I replied simply, not offering details or inviting further discussion. My life beyond our divorce wasn't something I had any interest in sharing with him, regardless of how politely he was attempting to engage. An uncomfortable silence stretched between us as Brandon apparently realized I wasn't going to facilitate conversation by asking about his life or work in return. "I've been thinking about that night at the Sterling Room," he said finally, his voice dropping lower as if discussing something shameful. "I handled things badly throughout our marriage, Claire. I was arrogant and dismissive and I took you for granted. I wanted you to know that I recognize that now, even though it's too late to matter." His confession sounded rehearsed, as if he'd practiced the words with a therapist or read them in some self-help book about accountability. "I appreciate you acknowledging that," I said carefully, recognizing that this moment wasn't about him earning my forgiveness but about him alleviating his own guilt. "I hope you've learned something about treating partners with actual respect and consideration." Then I excused myself politely, walking away from Brandon for the final time without anger or regret, just genuine indifference to whatever emotional processing he was attempting to involve me in. The following spring brought unexpected opportunity when Leonard Foster announced he was retiring and recommended me to replace him as department head at Hartwell and Associates. The promotion represented massive professional advancement, positioning me as the youngest person to hold leadership role at our firm in over 20 years. The salary increase meant I could afford a larger apartment and start building real savings for the first time since my divorce. More importantly, the recognition validated everything I'd rebuilt about my sense of professional capability after years of having it systematically undermined. I stood in my sage green bedroom the night before my first day as department head, looking at my reflection and barely recognizing the confident woman staring back at me. 18 months earlier, I'd been someone who apologized for existing, who minimized her accomplishments and accepted contempt disguised as affection. The transformation hadn't been magical or instant, but the accumulated effect of consistent work toward healing had created someone fundamentally different from the woman who'd served divorce papers at that restaurant. Diane threw a celebration dinner at her apartment, inviting the friends who'd supported me through the divorce and the rebuilding that followed. We toasted my promotion and laughed about how far I'd come since that night when I'd shown up at her door after walking out of the Sterling Room. "You've always been this person," Diane said when the evening was winding down. "Brandon just convinced you that you weren't. All you did was remember who you actually were underneath his lies." Her words settled something inside me, a final piece of understanding about what had happened and what I'd survived. Brandon hadn't destroyed me, though he'd certainly tried. He'd obscured my view of myself so thoroughly that I'd almost forgotten what I looked like without his distortions. The divorce hadn't created a new person but had cleared away enough fog that I could finally see clearly again. Dr. Holloway and I ended our regular therapy sessions that summer, both of us recognizing that I developed tools and awareness to continue healing independently. She reminded me that setbacks were normal and expected, that old patterns would resurface during stress and require conscious redirection. "But you've proven you can recognize those patterns now," she said during our final appointment. "You've built a life that reflects your actual values and preferences rather than someone else's judgment. That's the foundation everything else builds on." I started dating again that fall, approaching relationships with clarity about what I would and wouldn't accept that I'd lacked during my 20s. The first few attempts were awkward and brief, teaching me that being single was vastly preferable to being with someone who didn't enhance my life. I learned to trust my instincts when something felt wrong rather than convincing myself to give situations more chances than they deserved. I discovered that I actually enjoyed the autonomy of single life enough that partnership would need to offer something genuinely valuable to be worth the compromise. 2 years after serving Brandon those divorce papers, I attended the opening of a photography exhibition at a gallery in downtown Belmont. The artist was someone I'd met through work connections, and her images explored themes of transformation and resilience that resonated deeply with my own journey. Standing in front of a photograph showing a woman's face half in shadow and half in light, I felt gratitude for every difficult moment that had brought me to this place of genuine contentment. My phone buzzed with a message from Trish asking if I wanted to grab drinks after the exhibition. I smiled and replied yes, then turned back to the artwork in front of me. The woman in the photograph looked strong and peaceful, comfortable with complexity rather than demanding simple answers. She looked like someone who'd survived something difficult and emerged knowing her own worth. She looked, I realized with quiet satisfaction, exactly like me. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.